Welcome to TSG Talk. TSG Talk aims to contribute positively towards the care of an injured casualty or vulnerable patient. If your goal is to maximise your input for the people you care for, then TSG Talk is for you. Our podcast will interview colleagues who are at the cutting edge of their professions. Often they're involved in creating solutions for areas that historically have proven difficult, or have a wealth of experience in a particular complex response. Each podcast will provide unique, engaging content. At TSG Associates, we will always strive to ensure our solutions are ahead of the curve and positively impact on the quest for prioritising survival and minimising suffering. We believe TSG Talk will complement our vision and provide a platform to enhance your response. It is my pleasure to now pass you across to our host, Senior Partner at TSG, Colin Smart.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of our podcast, TSG Talk. It's a wonderful talk tonight, and it's one of the subjects that certainly in the world of emergency planning can often be seen as an incredibly difficult task. Tonight, we're going to be exploring some of the concepts of the evacuation of a hospital. And I think what really is interesting tonight is where we're going to be doing it from real experience. Wexford General Hospital in the south of Ireland had to do a complete evacuation of over 200 patients. We're very privileged tonight to talk to Rose Fitzgerald, who was one of the senior managers who helped administrate and coordinate this task. What we'll learn tonight is the many lessons that were learned from doing this evacuation. We'll also learn why the evacuation was so successful and what were some of the foundations put in place to allow this to happen. It's a wonderful talk. Mary Rose is hugely engaging and has a vast amount of knowledge, and certainly from my point, I picked up some real key points that I think are important, not really just for hospital evacuation and emergency planning, but for the wider scope of general emergency planning throughout the world of emergency medicine and pre-hospital care. So I really hope you enjoy this evening's talk. I certainly found it hugely engaging and informative. Mary Rose is a wonderful guest, and I would like to thank her again for her time this evening. So enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, we're always after a like and subscribe, and a 5-star rating is hugely appreciated. That just really helps TSG Talk be recognised by more of the pod site, so more people can have access to this information. So thanks, everybody.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of TSG Talk. On many of our podcasts, we explore the unique challenges of providing medical care in complex environments. Hospital evacuation is often seen as one of the most complex tasks that any organisation can face. How do we evacuate patients from a facility specifically designed for often complex care to another facility without compromising their safety and the standard of care? Today we will learn how Wexford General Hospital in Ireland managed this task. It truly is an amazing story. And we're privileged to talk with Mary Rose Fitzgerald, Emergency Planning Officer, HSE South, who will kindly talk us through how the event unfolded, its management and the lessons learned. So good afternoon, Mary Rose. It's lovely to see you, and thank you so much for taking part in TSG Talk this afternoon. Really looking forward to talking through this with you. Just before we go into the subject today, could you just give our listeners just a little bit of your own background and how you got into emergency management?
Thanks, Colin. So I'm actually an environmental health officer. I studied environmental health, and I unfortunately graduated during the crash and immigrated to New Zealand. And in New Zealand, environmental health is actually quite integral to the emergency management response. So I got lots of experience there working through tsunami warnings, the Christchurch earthquake, and a couple of other emergencies that came along. And then I came back. I worked in the UK for a little while, but I settled back in Ireland working in emergency management for the health service. And since I joined in 2018, so I'm probably a bad omen, but since I joined, I've had COVID. We had the national cyber attack on our health infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, and we've had quite a lot of severe weather.
Okay, so you've been kept rather busy as you've gone through your career.
Yeah.
It's interesting you said that you went to New Zealand. I think I'm talking to a few people who work out in emergency services in New Zealand. It's amazing the diversity of risks such a small geographic space has. I'm always fascinated at some of the things that they really need to solve within the size of population that they've actually got.
I started off working in Auckland City, which you think, oh, it's city centre, but I actually had quite a few remote islands that I looked after. So tsunami warnings were actually a really big thing for us and preparing for them. And certainly living in Ireland is not something I ever thought about. So it was a really big learning curve. And the same when I moved to the South Island with earthquakes. Again, and not just earthquakes, but landslides and all sorts of things like that. And quite a lot of the population as well in the rural communities, they don't have mains infrastructure. So, losing water supply and trying to get water into them is a huge issue.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, it sounds, New Zealand, unfortunately, I've never been there, but it does sound the most amazing place to visit. But certainly from an emergency planning point of view, it does sound absolutely fascinating place to be sort of carrying out your occupation. Just moving back to closer places. The actual hospital, Wexford General Hospital, could you just give us a little bit of an idea of the size of this hospital and the sort of the facility it provides for the local community?
Yeah, so Wexford General is located in the southeast corner of Ireland. So anyone who knows Ireland, it's right down in the southeast corner. It's quite strategically located there. It's a 280-bed hospital. Their ED is quite busy. They see about 50,000 attendances in a year. They have about 1,500 births go through their maternity ward, so it's quite a busy place. They have about 9,000 day cases in a year there and about 16,000 inpatients, along with all of their outpatient appointments, chronic illnesses and other things. It's a really strategically located place because while Wexford on its own mightn't have a huge population, the population swells in the summertime. It's a really big tourist attraction. And the hospital is an important part of providing healthcare for the community and for those visiting.
So it's very much a substantial healthcare facility serving a very large region. I think that's what I'm really picking up from that. This is not a small community hospital. This is a significant player in providing health services for a large geographical area.
Yeah, it's a really important part of the health services for the region. So yeah, even though it's 280 beds, so it's not a small hospital, but it is a really busy hospital as well. And it deals an awful lot with chronic illnesses as well. It's not just about the acutes coming through their EDs. And they have a lot of people who are very ill availing of their services on a regular basis.
And just picking up 1,500 births a year. So from your maternity point of view, again, that seems quite a substantial setup that you've got there as well.
Yeah, it has one of the highest birth rates through a maternity ward for a non-city location. So it's a really busy spot. They care for an awful lot of mums and babies every year. It's a really important part of the community. Everyone in that region has had a connection to maternity services in Wexford.
Right. Okay, fantastic. No, that's quite a facility. And I think as we talk about as the event unfolded, the size of the facility and the population it serves become really important, and especially some of the aftermath of the event. So just going on to the actual event then, could you let us know what actually happened?
Yeah, so it was the 1st of March 2023, and it was a normal day as far as any of us were concerned. We were still in surge for most of the services in the health service in Ireland, still coming out of winter. So everyone was really busy. And at about 4 o'clock, I got a call from the Chief Emergency Management Officer that there had been reports of a fire at Wexford General. Now, it wouldn't be unusual for us to get reports like this, but it often transpires to be something really minor. But what I was on the phone to him, I had about 6 missed calls, so definitely knew something was up. So the hospital manager there had actually seen the fire at about 20 to 4. And fire services were called at 3:45. So they were already on scene. And then at 4:25, I spoke with our regional chair for the area crisis management team. So not the team in the hospital, but all the wraparound services that we would have in the region. And we could confirm at that point the fire had broken out. We didn't have a huge amount of information, but based on social media, it looked substantial. And we were going convening our area crisis management team. And when we got them together at 5 o'clock, national news had quite a lot of coverage about the fire. And we informed all of the hospitals and community services on that call to prepare to receive evacuated patients. We hadn't managed to make full contact with the hospital yet, as you can imagine. They were incredibly busy, already starting to, horizontally start to move patients away from the danger area. At 6 o'clock, there was an interagency on-site coordination meeting, and that's where the fire service were really able to give some information on what had happened. So the fire was in the plant room on the roof of the hospital. And where it was located was actually really near a lift shaft. So that meant all of the smoke and everything else coming out of the fire was able to find its way into the lower floors and particularly into our ICU and maternity areas. That was quite concerning. And also, even though the fire had been brought under control quite quickly due to the fire services, firefighting activities, the amount of water needed to bring the fire under control, we had substantial water damage through the hospital. And that was only the bits we could see. We weren't even actually able to get into the hospital yet. So we knew it was quite serious for the hospital. The hospital manager, having spoken with everyone, made the decision at 6 o'clock to declare a major emergency. So at that point, she just felt, we're not going to be able to deliver safe patient care. And I don't know how long it's going to take us to be able to do that. So she declared the major emergency. And once she did that, that allowed us to activate all of our plans, all the other hospitals in the region and those with connections to hospitals within the region were activating their surge plans and getting ready to receive patients. Didn't really have any timings on that or anything yet. It was just a go, go, go. The hospital or the crisis management team for the region, we met 3 times that evening. And that was quite important just to make sure information was getting shared. We were able to move patients in an easy way. But really, it was the clinical governance team and the National Ambulance Service on the scene at the hospital who worked really, really hard to, look at the patients, look at their current status, their illness, all of that, and then make a decision on where best they could be accommodated in the hospitals that had made accommodation for them. And that wasn't an easy thing to do, but they were able to do it quite quickly and effectively. And then just to move the patients, we were so fortunate that when we activated our emergency plans, that also activates the voluntary emergency services, who in their droves brought ambulances to the scene. We had 78 ambulances come down to help us move patients. So they were integral to being able to move. In the end, we moved 91 patients, and that included some ICU patients as well, also new mums and babies. And they discharged about 100 patients with referral letters into community services in the following days. And look, we were so lucky, no one was injured. Not a patient, not a staff member, not an emergency response person was injured, which is incredible. And we kept 28 patients on site. So by the time between 6 o'clock that evening and 2 a.m. when we officially stood down the evacuation, they had found that ED, oddly enough, was actually quite unscathed from the whole thing. And we were able to comfortably take those 28 patients. But like clinical governance was really difficult. A lot of patients with chronic illnesses, a lot of patients in palliative care. It wasn't an easy thing. You're now moving them away from their families, away from their community. So it was not an enviable task that the clinical governance team were undertaking. But that was incredible as far as I'm concerned. It's one of the days where I was very happy to work for the health service, the way everyone came together. But the real work actually started the next day, because we now had lost an ED in an area that was now going to be geographically isolated. And we didn't know when we were going to get that ED back. So that started to put huge pressure on our ambulance service travel times, on the other EDs in the region who now had taken in additional patients from the night before to assist us, but we're now getting extra people turning up at their EDs. So quite difficult. But we stayed in a state of major emergency for 10 days. So that's kind of how long it took us to really get a handle on reorientating services and being in a position where we knew how long we might be without an ED and how we could manage services while the rebuild was going on. So it was quite a challenge, but the recovery piece, well, we always talk about recovery, but it really does take a lot of planning. Some of it you can plan for, some of it you can't, but it takes a huge amount of time.
Wow. So I'm picking up so many points from what you said there. So let me try and summarize some of that, because I think there's some absolutely really interesting points that we can all learn from. I think what I'm picking up from that is this wasn't an insignificant event. This was a fire that basically took the whole building out. Maybe didn't burn everything down, but smoke caused the problem, water caused the problem. There was multiple sort of elements caused by fire that were causing different problems. But this was a whole building event that you were having to deal with. It wasn't just one section of the hospital. This was everything. One point I found really interesting, and it seems to be quite, is that you said your chief executive, I think at 6 o'clock, actually said it launched the major emergency plan, and that was a trigger. And I find that quite interesting, because that seems to have been the trigger that seems to have released more of the resources to go into sort of emergency response. Would you say that being able to make that call early is a big thing when we're managing the event? Would you say that was quite significant?
Is absolutely crucial. I mean, and it was the hospital manager who made the decision and spoke with the chair or the chief officer for the area emergency or for the crisis management team. But, you know, it's not that we had resources sitting in the wings doing nothing. We didn't. But as soon as it was declared, it really sold it to everyone. This is a real event. This is really happening. So all of the other hospitals were able to activate their own plans and say, okay, we're now in surge. If we weren't already, we now are. It allowed us to activate our MOUs with our external partners. So voluntary emergency services were integral to moving. We also had the Defence Forces on standby, and we also had other rapid response teams from other services who we didn't have to use, but they had put themselves available to us. So it was just absolutely crucial. And also it was March. So at 6 o'clock, we still had a bit of daylight.
Okay.
That was really important.
Yeah.
We were able to see things and allowed us to set things up. And also, even though our interagency partners were already on site and communicating and sharing information, in Ireland, once one service declares, the other two declare as well. And that's, again, if there's support needed, they can make it available.
No, I think that was one really interesting point I picked up. Once that decision was made, then it allowed that cascade of everybody making decisions. So I think that's a very important point to bring out. Is probably early notification of the event and declaring the event is probably something every organisation should think about and back the person that's probably doing it. They're not always going to get it right, but I think if they take that judgment, it's probably to the greater good of most of the events that potentially we'll be dealing with. So that's very interesting. Some of the numbers I found really interesting as well. You said you evacuated 91 patients, but really interesting that you did a discharge of 100 patients as well. And that's something I found quite interesting in some of the work we've done in hospital evacuation. We've looked at the role of rapid discharge to smooth the evacuation a little bit. So I think that's something that probably, if you were to guide people in some of the major things that they should think about, the rapid discharge of the patients is probably quite important, given you've only got a limited amount of facilities to evacuate people to. I mean, again, when you're looking at that, the 100 people you discharged, do you think that had a significant sort of consequences on the event? Do you think it helped much, or do you think if you hadn't evacuated them, would have been a lot more difficult? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we certainly wouldn't have had beds for all of them. We would have made a lot. There were more beds made available than we actually needed on the night, but they were needed the next day. So the recovery process definitely would have been impacted if we had discharged less patients. But also the clinical governance to be able to discharge patients, that was absolutely critical, because it's a big decision. You know, you have to think about that patient and what you're doing and community services. And that was a really important part of the recovery process. was making sure that community services were actually going to be able to take in all these referrals that were going to come to them, and how would they be able to manage it. So providing that reorientation and enhancing their service was really, really important. And again, that's something you think, well, if you planned for this, surely you would have thought about it, but I'm not sure we considered the chronic illnesses that people had. And if you're in hospital, you're usually there for a reason. So how do we manage that? And we certainly thought during the evacuation process, our plan had always been that we would evacuate into community and acute facilities. There was no way some of these patients could go to a community facility. They just wouldn't have had, the equipment and the level of staff that would be needed. So there was a lot of learning and also a lot of pressure on that clinical governance team.
And I can imagine, because I suppose their role when you're looking at evacuation is to minimize any interruption in care for the journey that they're going to take, and also making sure the level of care they go into is the standard that they require. Because you're right, we're not moving people who are not complex. It's difficult, isn't it? So I think the complexity of those decisions when you're looking at multiples must have been quite a task for them to carry out. So it sounds like just the sheer numbers of people they discharged and moved, they did an amazing job. The other thing I'm picking up is just how many organisations are involved in this. This is not the hospital doing the evacuation, is it? I've just noted a few down: National Ambulance Service, we've got the Fire Brigade, we've got Defence, we've got your clinical governance, you've got community services, and I've probably missed a few. But this would seem to be a genuinely multiple agency event, and everybody that looks to be involved is critical to the success of it. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it absolutely was. So just very similar to the GESF principles in the UK. We have 3 principal response agencies in local authority, the health service, and An Garda Síochána police force. So like the guards were integral in setting up the cordons, the traffic cordons, making sure that ambulances were able to easily get in and out of the site, and also manage any other onlookers who might have turned up. It's so important that they were there. The local authorities, so our fire services are attached to local authorities. So while the fire service were wonderful in doing what they had to do, local authority was also incredible. So hospitals are actually located across the road from the local authority building. As it was after 5 o'clock, they made their entire building available to us, and it became the ambulance staging area, because we just had so many ambulances come from our voluntary emergency services. They weren't going to be able to accommodate them on the site of the hospital. So they were all staged over in the local authority building. They made welfare available for staff. They were just absolutely incredible. And then we had all the others who made themselves available as well. Defence forces had stood up before we even contacted them. There were rapid response teams already on the way. It was absolutely amazing. But I think it only worked because that is our process, and everybody knew what the process was. So they were ready.
That makes so much sense. And it sounds like, we'll talk about the preparation in a little bit, but it sounds like the preparation and the planning and training you had for this was probably critical to the success of what you managed to achieve.
Yeah, particularly knowing who your partners are. It's so silly in one way, but being able to say, oh, I know you, I've met you before, and having that relationship was really important.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important. The other thing that I really picked up as well, and I think any organisation will probably, if we could say what could you get out of this, is that you say it's not just about the evacuation, it's what happens the next day. And as you said, you were 10 days in a state of emergency, but we've now moved a lot of people. This has not stopped, has it? We've gone through one part of the process of taking them out of the dangerous building, get them to the proper areas of care, but we've now got people dispersed all over the place, and we're down the facility. So the emergency hasn't stopped just because we evacuated. That's probably what I'm picking up from that one.
And that early declaration feeds into that as well. So certainly on the night, the National Ambulance Service would have said, oh, we're grand. We've enough vehicles, we can cover this. And as well, all the hospitals who made beds available, they were just like, we'll make it work. But 2 days later, the hospital is bursting at the seams, and it's like we can't cope anymore. We've got far too many people we have to look after, because we were they were really helpful and took patients, but also they got extra people turning up at their doors. Ambulance times were tripling for travel. So they were now the same resource traveling a lot further. They had over 60-minute waiting times became the absolute norm at most of the hospitals. Again, because the hospitals were under so much pressure, and community services were seeing extra referrals into their service. Out of hours GP services all of that had to be augmented to deal with this. So anyone on the night who wasn't sure if we were in a major emergency, 2 days later, they were definitely sure. And the knock-on effect, we don't give enough time to recovery when we're planning. We certainly felt that anyway, that we talk about recovery, but we don't really talk about recovery and how long it's actually going to take. And that was a huge problem for us.
Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to pick up from that is that this evacuation has ripples through every part of the health service. It's touching every piece of the health service in some way and putting pressure on already busy facilities. So this is rippling everywhere, and over a prolonged period of time as well. How did you find it with your staff? Because obviously, you would have staff on scene when the emergency was actually happening, and obviously they would have protracted hours, and all the other facilities are now taking more people. So I would presume people are working longer hours just to cope with the immediate emergency. But did you learn anything about how you manage people's hours? So like maybe in day 3 or 4, where a huge amount of your staff had worked maybe longer hours. How did you find the ongoing staffing of it went? Did you find there was any sort of fatigue creeping in with people, or did you have to manage the shift systems or anything at all?
I think in general, every single health service across the world will tell you everyone's fatigued at the moment. COVID has had that effect. Because we actually lost the hospital for a little while, that wasn't really an issue for hospital staff. And the National Ambulance Service are quite used to having to stand up and stand down staff. So that worked out okay for them. But what was an issue was the other hospitals were looking for additional staff to go and support them because they were under so much pressure. And we didn't really have a HR policy to allow us to redeploy people, especially when we didn't know how long we'd be redeploying them for. And we weren't really sure of what their terms and conditions would be, and there would be changes to it and all of that. Now, staff were amazing and for the most part got on with it and worked with HR to work these things out. But we certainly had never conceived, we've definitely thought about it for weather events for 24, 36-hour period. We never thought about it on a prolonged basis where, this facility is not available. Can we redeploy someone to where the pressure now is?
Yeah, and I suppose one of the complexities of where it was, it's quite rural, and the geographic distances are quite significant between facilities. So it's not like in a metropolitan area, the next hospital may be 1 to 2 miles away. I mean, we're talking significant distances, I would think.
Yeah, so it's about 60 miles to the next hospital. So if you're commuting, that's completely changing how you're used to working. We never really consider, it's the whole recovery thinking it through.
Yeah, and I think by the sounds of it, where we often focus, and certainly the areas we've looked at in hospital evacuation, we've always focused on the evacuation and doing that safely and doing it efficiently and doing that in an organised manner. It sounds like the sort of the longer term recovery phase is a whole extra area we really need to put the same, if not more, time into to really understand all the pressures and all the ripples. How do we solve things like somebody who's now got a 60-mile commute, who may have a family, who may have to get back for childcare? It's complicated.
Yeah, it really is. And all those support services, HR, finance, estates, media and comms, they were crucial in recovery. Like they were absolutely integral to making sure that recovery process started quickly and could be as effective as it possibly could be. And I don't think it's that we forget about them. They're in all our plans. We do think about it. But I don't think we've maybe always resourced those support services to be able to scale up the way we need them to in recovery.
No, that's a very interesting point. Just thinking about some of the challenges you faced on the actual evacuation itself, was there any specific challenges that you came across, and did you come across any solutions on the actual evening or maybe the day after to fix those problems?
We never envisaged actually losing an entire facility. So definitely thought about evacuation, losing part of a campus, all of that, but we never really envisaged losing an entire facility the way that we did with Wexford. You know, everyone coming together was so important, but the National Ambulance Service were particularly important in that they took their mass casualty plans, basically ran it backwards in order for us to evacuate people out of the hospital. So that quick thinking to say, well, we don't have an exact plan for this, but we do something very like it, was just brilliant. And their work with the voluntary emergency services, because they do train and exercise together, it was absolutely seamless. You know, they were just able to fit together straight away, which that was so important for us. And then the beginning of recovery was a really big challenge. So within 36 hours of the hospital going on fire and us losing the ED and other services there, we had 2 government ministers and the Taoiseach come to visit. So, you know, this is going to happen. We write our plans about VIP visits and how we're going to manage them. But it actually was a really big challenge. Wexford General has a really important connection with the community. So having that national political focus on the hospital, it did rile up some of the community about, would the services definitely be restored? Is it, you know, we're definitely going to get our ED back? All of that kind of thing. And certainly the local media were very hot on any of the visitors who came down. One of them started a stop clock on their website to make sure everyone knew how long ED had been closed. But our media team worked so hard to keep that engagement with the local community, to make sure they knew what was going on with the hospital, no matter what was being said at a national or political level. This is what's happening. If you need healthcare services right now, this is where you go. Because we really didn't conceive how long all of those VIP visits were going to take. The police investigation, the health and safety investigation, the insurance assessors, you know, all of that had to be sorted out before we were able to really start recovery. And despite all that, our estates team were incredible. And so we had the fire on a Wednesday, and then Friday evening, maternity services reopened in the hospital. So they were able to accept the mums and babies that they already had on their list in and be able to deliver, which was just, I don't know how they did it. And it was a challenge working around the workmen who were trying to bring the hospital back together again. But, you know, that communication piece was so important, and not just worrying about our VIPs, but also really thinking about the community, and they knew what was happening. We've touched on it already, but like the partnerships are so important. Like, you know, the way the Gardaí came in and the fire service came in and just got involved and did their jobs, but were able to do it because they felt so comfortable. They knew everyone at the hospital. But something that we did learn on the night was not everybody maybe felt that the declaration was the best idea. And certainly in the debriefs we've had, particularly with our external partners, they now get it. They're like, yeah, healthcare is complicated. It's a bed isn't, as we always say, a bed is not a bed. And they definitely understand that more, but it's also a lesson for us that, you know, something happened where it was a Garda-led incident or a fire-led incident. We don't know the ins and outs of it. So getting to know our partners and understand where they're coming from is really a good lesson to come out of this.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said, and I think it's a really good quote. A bed is not a bed. A bed is an accumulation of multiple complex resources. The bed is just the platform the patient happens to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, and certainly our regulator would agree with that, because when we tried to move patients, they weren't always happy with what we were doing. So
yeah, and I think that's such an important part. If you're looking, I've always looked at evacuation as or a good evacuation has been able to move somebody from one location where there's risk to another location where there's safety, but not interrupting their level of care at any point. And how we facilitate that through the correct resources of both of physical resources and human resources is really important, because if we get any of that wrong, we put them in the wrong bed, we put them with the wrong person, with somebody that could be high dependency, we end up with failure and interruptions in the level of care. So I think that's so important where interagency is so important, is to get across that when we say we need this resource, there's a real reason for it, because we're trying to give optimum care in suboptimum locations. And if when we say this is why we need you to do it. And I think trying to get them to understand that's important, because you're right, there's many a time somebody who's not medical will just see a hospital ward bed as just a bed which we can take the brakes off, we can wheel it from A to B. And it's a little bit more often it's a little bit more complex than that.
There was a lot of discussion. There was fire in the hospital, so all of the medical gases had been turned off. Now, that seems really straightforward to people looking at it. You just turn it off, you turn it back on. But because of all of the smoke and everything else that happened, those fine particles get into the medical gas lines. So once we turned it off, it wasn't coming back on again. Until it had been fully assessed and we'd had an engineer come on, and that's going to take time. So yeah, it is more complex.
Yeah. But I think you're right, when it's such an interagency thing, I think they also don't need to know every complexity of what we're dealing with, but if they understand that a bed is just not a bed, and there's logic behind what we often ask people to do, that I think that's, as part of our training, it's always going to be a benefit when we're dealing with so many different agencies who don't come in with a complex medical mind. They come in with maybe a fire service mind or a police mind, voluntary services. They're a mix of skills, but it's trying to understand why we're asking for a certain requirement and being empathetic when we ask for that requirement. I think that's probably quite an important part on getting the preparation right. It's fascinating. One really important point I picked up, and I've never really thought of it, was your engagement with the local community. And I suppose it makes a lot of sense. Where we live in Halifax, we have Calderdale Hospital. It's a fairly large community hospital, but it's often in the press, and people really care about their hospitals. There is definitely a local community attachment to your hospital, whether it's rural or city. People really care about them, and being able to update the community on what's available, what's not available, will it come back again, because there could be politics in it. I'd never really thought of that as something we would have to do, but it makes so much sense, doesn't it? Because if you don't have that level of communications, then you're going to get a lot of inquiries coming to you, which is then going to stress your system. So trying to be proactive on communicating state of play, what's available, what's not available, rough timelines. That sounds a hugely important bit, recovery wise, and just caring for your community as well, to give them the information.
And we were changing how they would access, like, not just the fact that the hospital isn't operating as a hospital, new services or enhanced services were coming in to support the delivery of healthcare, but it was completely different to what people were used to. Particularly when minor injury unit was set up, people are like, well, what's a minor injury unit? What does that mean? And it's not an ED, but it can treat a lot of illnesses that sometimes you might be sent to ED for. So making sure people understood that. And then the referral system into community services, like, they completely enhanced how they delivered service in order to take pressure off acute hospitals. And a community paramedic was also introduced into the region as well, which they'd never had before. And a Pathfinder clinic, Pathfinder vehicle, which has an interdisciplinary health team. The idea is to try and help people stay at home as long as possible. So these are things that people had never experienced before. So it's really important they understood it so that they would engage with it.
No, I think you've picked up a really important point of that communication with the community, changing of healthcare. What's the limitations of that healthcare, or actually what's not the limitations of what we're now getting? Could it be better than what you had before? It's just that whole package of communications to inform is really, really important. And to be honest, something I've never really thought about, but now you've mentioned it, so important. Early recovery phase, as we move the process on. Absolutely fascinating. Just if you were to talk to a fellow emergency planning manager who's trying to work out hospital evacuation, as many are, what would be the 3 points you would say to them that you think could really help them to help them plan or validate the planning that they're doing? Was there any big points that come out that you say these are the big things that we got from this?
Yeah, like training, and I know we talk about training all the time. The staff were amazing. They were incredibly calm. They were very confident in how to evacuate a person, a ward, whatever they needed to do. They were absolutely excellent. But it's not actually just about the evacuation. It's a lot of them didn't realize that there's a crisis management team meeting, National Ambulance Service is helping to coordinate. We've got support from voluntary services. You know, they didn't understand all the other things going on, and that caused them to worry. You know, how are we actually going to evacuate? So knowing that there's more to just evacuation, there's a whole lot of stuff going on around the way. And also it takes a lot of time to evacuate. We started evacuating at 6 o'clock at night. It was 2 in the morning before we officially stood down.
Right.
So we talk about vertical and horizontal. It takes a lot of time. And that's a good thing in some ways. You know, it allows everyone to prepare. You know, if patients need medication, we can plan around all of that. But that's a really long time to be managing transport in and out and slowly moving patients along. So it does take time. But the early declaration made all the difference. So it does take time.
Yeah.
And the reorientation of services, like, I think COVID was incredible. I think as all health services were incredibly innovative. If you haven't written it down already, write down some of the great stuff that you did, because trust me, if you have to evacuate an entire facility and it's now unavailable to you, a lot of that innovation is really, really helpful.
Okay.
So don't lose it. You know, nothing is ever done as a waste, so don't lose it. And the relationships. You know, I know sometimes, you know, you think, oh, it's another meeting. I have other things I need to do, but, you know, go into the meetings, getting to know all of those internal and external partners and being comfortable with them and not being afraid to exercise. You know, if someone says, oh, I'd really like to test this, you don't be afraid to put your hand up and say, yeah, we'll get on board with that. Because it really helps, and it helps not just the evacuation, but everything that happens afterwards. Because, you know, Wexford County Council and the Gardaí were so supportive throughout the process. You know, the recovery could not have been as smooth without their help.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting points. So just to try and summarize that a little bit, because we're bringing out some wonderful learning points. Training's a big thing. And understanding that it's multiple agencies and all the agencies need to be trained. Yes, at times we'll train with an isolation in our own specific bit of the evacuation, but we've got to bring all the agencies in that are going to be involved. So it's a truly multiple agency event. So we're all pulling together in the same direction. I found it was really interesting is to consider the time it takes, because I think this is something I've picked up from hospital evacuation. There are times we're going to move somebody quickly from A to B with this imminent danger, but actually more often than not, there's time to take a breath, because as you say, these are complex cases. There needs to be clinical considerations about each stage of the evacuation for us to do this safely. So it isn't something we're probably trying to do very quickly. We're trying to do it in a more considered way. And with the complexity and the volume of people we're going to move, then that is going to take a period of time. And I think that's a different mindset to, often people think evacuation, quick, fast rescue. Actually, as I understand, a lot of hospital evacuation is actually take a breath, considered clinical pathways, making sure there's no interruption of care, working at the facility. Then it's a slower process. Once we've got through the initial sort of they're in danger, we have got them out of danger, but we've got time to take the breath because it's too complex to do quickly. I think that's probably would you agree with that? Or
yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I know the first priority in the hospital at the time was ICU, and anybody in theatre was to make sure that, you know, there were swift decisions made there. And there was one ward that was in particular danger where people were moved very quickly. But outside of that, there was a lot of warning given and staff realizing that yeah, the hospital's in a bit of trouble here.
Mm-hmm.
They were phenomenal. They were bringing drugs trolleys with them. They were bringing oxygen cylinders, masks. They brought everything with them because I think they understood that this is going to take a while. We're not just throwing everybody out into the car park.
Yeah.
We're going to do this nice and steady.
Yeah.
And they were getting loads of warning and communication around their patients and when they were going to be moved, which allowed them to plan then to make sure they could continue care delivery.
No, I think the really important part from this considering the time is the mindset. It's not, as you're right, the wrong mindset was everybody goes out to the car park. We've got to get everybody out of the building. Well, then everybody's in the car park and we've got suboptimal care for most of the people who are high dependency and the people that it really need the care and will deteriorate. That would be the wrong mindset. The right mindset was, are we safe? Let's take the breath and let's consider the pathways for each of these people. So I think that there's so many points we're learning from that, but that mindset of often we have time is probably an important mindset for anybody planning this type of evacuation. Fascinating. And the last point I picked on from that, well, actually 2 points, is write down your lessons learned. You said there's so many lessons we've learned from COVID, and many of them still being used. And I think any organisation, business included, we have learned so much on how we operate through different circumstances, and we wrote it down, and we still have some better practices because of it into our daily activity. But write it down with your lessons learned because they're all useful. And like the lecture that I listened to you giving Leeds and doing TSG talk, they're all things that we can pass on to other people to improve the next evacuation. So I think that's a very important thing. And the relationships, which we've picked up on a few times, if it's interagency, you need to know that agency. You need to know the type of person, how that person operates under stress, just how to cope with each other. We're all humans, aren't we? Some of us get on great, some of us don't. That's not a problem. We just have to know how to manage it, don't we? Managing the relationship under crisis is, if we know who we're dealing with, it's got to be an easier thing to do.
You're not going to be afraid to pick up the phone and say, I need some help. Can you come down here and sort this out for me? So yeah, it makes a huge difference. And just on the COVID stuff as well, are just about writing down lessons learned in general. Like we used severe weather plans, we used mass casualty plans, we used nearly every plan we ever wrote evacuating the hospital. We just changed it slightly based on things that we learned that we knew worked. So a plan is never wasted if you've written it down properly and thought about it. So I know people think, oh, writing a plan, but it's worth putting it on paper because on the night it saved us.
Good. No, I think that's important. I am definitely a great one for planning, and I certainly can't agree more. The plan is a well-written, well-implemented plan is never ever a wasted time. I can't agree more with that. So just before we go into a final question, where are you now with your hospital? Are you fully repaired and up and running, or are we sort of semi-functional at the moment? Where are you now?
Yeah, so it took 150 days to get ED open. So that we had a fire in March and then ED open around the end of July. But all of the inpatient beds weren't quite up and running. They kind of came into being maybe just before Christmas, October, November. Now it's pretty much running as usual, but unfortunately, on-call accommodation hasn't been reinstated, and a couple of other outpatient ones are still working off-site, just because of construction that's still ongoing. But it is basically back up and running.
Good, fantastic. It sounds like from the minute the event happened all the way through the recovery process to the rebuilding process and back to normality. I won't say it won't have gone with it bumps, but it does sound like a very well-managed event from beginning to end. That's the general feeling I'm getting from it. It's, if these things, I don't think you ever wasn't, success is probably the wrong word, but it sounds like it was incredibly well processed all the way through.
Yeah, and like a lot of that was down to some of the people who were there on the night, and some of them who were part of the recovery process, extremely experienced, and just well able to look at the problem and figure out the best solution. So that was really important. And the estates team, who never really probably saw their role in recovery to the extent that it was. They just picked up and ran with it. So
no
they
worries.
were amazing.
No, that's makes a lot of sense. So just one last question before I try and summarize. Summarizing, I've got so many really good points to pick up. Hopefully I've picked up the most, but please let me know if I don't. But just one question we ask all of our guests. Now, normally we ask for a piece of medical equipment, but obviously you've coming in more from the management side of life. But if you were to pick one piece of equipment you would always have with you, regardless of whatever event that you were involved in, what do you think it would be?
So you did give me a heads up in this question because I had to think about it. I had to think
It's
about
a
it for a
thoughtful
little
one.
while. But having all the emergencies I've been through, particularly working for the health service here, it's my phone. My phone has everything in it. You know, I can take notes, I can take pictures of things, I can keep a log of what's going on. And also, because of the job that I have, I meet so many of our external partners all day, every day. I have very strong relationships with them. So my contact list is extensive.
Right.
And I'm quite sure some of them wish they didn't have to answer my calls. But that is so important. You know, during COVID, during the evacuation of the hospital, nobody ever said no. And that's not because I'm amazing. It's because of the relationships that we all worked really hard to build. So yeah, it's definitely my phone.
Definitely phone. Just to add to that, do you think if your phone's so important, it would be worth having a mobile charger with you, just in case you can't charge it?
Absolutely. I have a 2-phone system.
Right, okay.
Where I have one for outgoing calls, I have one for incoming calls.
Right, yeah, because I can just imagine your battery running out wouldn't be a good thing with it being such an important piece of kit.
Yeah, it's definitely, but I think we all are like that now. Without our phones, we'd be lost.
Yeah. So the phone is what you'll have with you. So we're very happy to give you a phone, your 2 phones and the charger. So,
yeah.
But we'll class that as one resource. Fantastic. So let me just try and pick up the main points that I picked up from our conversation, and I really have picked up a lot. I always find the summaries really useful at the end if somebody's listening in and they want to try and apply the conversation to some of the work that they're doing. So the biggest points I think I've picked up is that if there is an emergency in your hospital that you think that there's a possibility for an evacuation, don't be scared to make the call early. We can always go back on it, but an early call allows everybody else to have time to scale up as well. And that is a major factor. So somebody who's got the responsibility to make that call, to start the logistics of everything is important. So we need to make that call sooner, probably, rather than later. This is, although it's one building we're evacuating in the hospital, it's not just the hospital doing this. This is taken in multiple organizations of all different skills, size and ability, you know, from the voluntary, well, not saying one's more than the other, but we've got voluntary agency, we've got military, we've got police, we've got fire, we've got clinical teams. There is a plethora of people all going to bring critical skills into doing this. So working out how all those organizations can work together and blending that matrix so it's efficient is going to be massive in how we're successful in doing this. I found the area we talked about rapid discharges being important. If we're, you know, with looking to move nearly 200 people, but if we could do a rapid discharge as you did with the best part of 100 people, that probably changed the dynamics of the evacuation quite significantly. But as you rightly pointed out, the skill to do that is not simple. That takes really considered clinical assessment and also making sure the correct resource for that discharge is in place as well. So we've got the continuity of care. So I think it's an important part in evacuation, but really has to be thought through if we're going to do it. It shouldn't be a quick fix. I think it can help, but it really needs to be thought through. And I think if we get that bit right, we can really take some of the pressure off the people that do need to go to more definitive facilities further afield. It's not a single day event. You'll have the event, but the event doesn't stop once everybody's out of the building. You were saying the next day was very important, but it would, you know, your event itself, you said you were 10 days state of emergency, but it took a long time for your actual building to come fully online again. So your long-term planning and your recovery planning is something you said you've got to put a lot of resources and a lot of thought into. We often think about the evacuation as being the evacuation plan, but it sounds like the recovery plan warrants at least, if not more, thought processes moving towards it, which was very interesting. And the other couple more points I picked up was keeping your local community informed of the state of your facilities, the ability of facilities to come back online, where they can access care, will they have their hospital back, accepting that those are basically your customers and need to be taken care of and informed is very important. And if you get that right, it can be a real asset to a stressed out system already. Because if everybody's like not phoning the hospital to try and find where to go because they already know how to go or where they can find the appropriate care, it's just going to keep everything as calm as possible and as functional as possible. And I think the big point you've picked out all the way through is that probably the success of something like this is down to good relationships, knowing how people work with each other, knowing their expectations and their obligations within their evacuation and the recovery phase, and having been able to contact them and talk with them with a really good phone. But that would be the main points that I've picked up. Is there anything else you would pick up from that at all?
No, I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot in that.
Right, there is, yeah.
And definitely, I think the recovery planning definitely caught us in how long it's going to take. It's not that we didn't plan; it was how long it was going to take.
Yeah, and that I think that's again that seems to be one of the biggest learning points you've got. That recovery takes time, and it puts the ripple effect of recovery goes everywhere. It seems to touch every part of the health service and put every part of the existing health service under another level of pressure. And definitely, all of those points need to be thought through, and that's I can imagine not without complexities as you work through that process. No, absolutely wonderful. Look, I've picked up so many good points from what you did. I think the beauty of what we've been able to talk about today is that we often talk about the concept of evacuation planning. It's very rare that we get a whole hospital evacuating. And we often see it in maybe places like America, where you've got slow onset weather systems coming in, where they may have 10 days notice that there's a hurricane coming in, and it's a slower term evacuation. But to do a fast onset evacuation with over 200 people isn't something that happens very often. And to understand your experiences on it, and listen to the lessons learned and what you believe is important moving forward. I think that's hugely beneficial to the whole emergency planning community. So thank you so much for your time today. It's really been interesting. That concludes this edition of TSG Talk. If you'd like to listen to it, we're on all the major podcast sites. It would be fantastic if you could like us, subscribe to the site, and a 5-star review is always hugely useful for us. So we'll be back again with another TSG Talk in the near future with another hugely interesting guest. Thank you for your time for listening, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this edition of TSG Talk. We hope you found the content of benefit. Should you have any questions or require additional information, please visit tsgassociates.co.uk.